We spoke on the show about what South Africa can offer to the rest of the world in the context of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation currently taking place in Beijing. President Cyril Ramaphosa spoke about the importance of balancing trade with China as our largest trading partner. And one of the things that became clear, even during the BRICS summit here in the country recently, is that the volumes and value of trade between South Africa and other BRICS countries is significant. But they are selling more into our economies, and we're not flooding their markets with our products. So how do we balance the trade so that we are also flooding other markets and we're not just the suppliers of raw materials? And yes, we have wines that are becoming popular. We are big on rooibos and other things that we export, but we can do more. We import more than we export to them. Tshabalala is the Standard Bank Group CEO. He's currently in Beijing as part of the SA delegation led by President Cyril Ramaphosa, and he joins us now live. Mr. Sim, thank you so much for making time for us. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Manyathela. Very good to speak to you. Thank you.
So, as the SA delegation led by the president, you've been courting financiers there to invest in South Africa because, as the president said, we want to shift from being an importer of manufactured goods to being a major exporter. So there is this trade deficit. What opportunities are available for us beyond just the so-called celebrity products like rooibos, wine, the unique tourist experiences, and the biggest of them all, raw materials?
Clement, so firstly, I'm calling you, and you and I are having this conversation from the Chaoyang branch of the ICBC. Chaoyang is the largest suburb in Beijing. You're correct, we are attending the FOCAC, which is hugely significant for South Africa, the African continent, and for trade between China and South Africa. It's a hugely, hugely important event. If I could just give you and your listeners the scale of the opportunity here. I mean, if you think about China and Africa, the two are the largest and most dynamic economies in the world. And then China, as you rightly say, is Africa's largest creditor, and it's the largest foreign direct investor on the African continent, and it's also the largest trading partner. I'd like to challenge just the premise, though, of your question, which implies that being a producer of raw materials is a bad thing. It's not. Look at Australia and the UAE. They're the largest, amongst the largest and most profitable and prosperous countries in the world, and they export raw materials. So I don't think there's any shame in it as long as you're using your comparative advantage appropriately. China exports about $180 billion to Africa, and we export $70 billion as the African continent to China. But as for South Africa, the really important point to make here is that we have a total of two-way trade of $57 billion. We import 23.4 from them. We export 23.5. So we've got a surplus. And then in addition to that, the government, as you correctly say, is concerned about the fact that we export commodities and import manufactured goods. The real thing, though, is that we should be using our comparative advantage and the fact that we are part of the AfCFTA and the fact that we are part of the African continent, 1.2 billion people, GDP of $3 billion, infrastructure needed of $3.4 trillion, and we should be using our relationships with our colleagues and friends in China, in the European Union, in the US, be friends for everybody. It's to be part of the globalized network in the world, and we should use all those resources to benefit ourselves.
And I mean, it's
as you can tell.
It's incredible for us to be the exporters of raw materials. I don't think that's something to be shameful of. I just think there's more that we can offer to the rest of the world. Even with raw materials, this government has been talking about beneficiation, for instance, for so long, and we're not seeing that being implemented. So we need to manufacture goods that we can export. What opportunities do you think the African Continental Free Trade Area present in helping maybe just double the intra-Africa trade? Because I would imagine that when we are negotiating as a bigger market, that actually works for us as a continent.
Yeah, that's exactly my point. Africa exports $180 billion worth of goods to Africa. We only export 70 to China, so we should be looking for opportunities to export more. And China has committed actually to facilitating that trade. That was one of the big points made by President Xi yesterday at FOCAC. The practical things businesses can do are in partnership between Standard Bank and ICBC, for example. We are working hard to facilitate this trade. In our case, we facilitated trade flows of about 68 billion rand between China and Africa. And we supported growth of over 3,000 Chinese companies importing and doing work on the African continent. And we facilitate things like the China International Import Expo, where we facilitate relationships between Chinese importers and exporters and African importers and exporters. But my point, Clement, is there's work to be done, and we should be focusing on these things that we are good at as Africans. Yeah. In our case, we're a bank, and the largest bank in Africa, working in partnership with the largest bank in the world to facilitate this trade between Africa and China.
Yeah, and you're right in that there are things we need to get right, though, for all of this to happen, for us to take our rightful place in the world. Crime is still a big challenge. The visa backlogs, Transnet, energy reliability, and to be fair, there are some marginal improvements, but these things are still impediments even to foreign investments flowing into South Africa.
So Clement, that I'm a rational optimist. So again, I'll challenge the pessimist in that question of yours. So the optimist would say there are massive opportunities on the continent, and like you say, the FCFTA is massive. So we as Africans need the investment in infrastructure and productive capacity and manufacturing, which will help us to take advantage of our position in the world. South Africa, we have got a huge infrastructure deficit. Infrastructure South Africa estimates that we need roughly 153 public infrastructure projects that need expenditure of 158 billion rand. I mean, that is huge. So we've got to get on and facilitate those infrastructure investments, which then help us to beneficiate, which then help us to compete more with the world. But on the challenges, just to go directly to your question, I mean, South African diplomats based in China are fantastic, and I'm one of the people that's doffing my hat to them. But we do need better visa processes for Chinese visitors to South Africa. Let me just tell you this quick story. When I was coming to China, it took 3 days for me to get my visa. 3 days. My Chinese colleagues who work for the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China have to wait for months to get their visas. And happily, the president committed to working hammer and tongs to smooth this out. The second one, I overheard there's an ad for SAA, I think, on your program. SAA needs to fly directly to China. It used to be one of the best routes that the country had. We don't have it anymore. So if one wants to go to China these days, you've got to follow the Silk Road. You've got to go to the UAE and then fly across over the Gobi Desert to get to China, when you could fly directly. So SAA, we would encourage the reopening of that route. The last one is agricultural goods. We are a big exporter. We've got a comparative advantage as a country. We need better trade protocols between South Africa and China to make sure that we get our agricultural products across to China at the cheapest and most efficient way of doing it. So those would be the key things I'd say. Challenges, and it's things that we can get right to facilitate trade.
All right. And just quickly, Mr. Sim, you announced some major leadership changes at Standard Bank recently. You've reinstated the Deputy Group CEO role, I think after a decade, if I'm not mistaken, appointing Kenny Fihla to that position. What necessitated this leadership shakeup? So
Kenny and I were out here to see our clients. I just told you that, for example, my next meeting is going to be with a senior executive of ICBC, and then the meeting after that is going to be with a massive, one of the largest agricultural companies in the world. That meeting is going to be with our Chinese partners and that client. Tonight, we'll be having a dinner with ICBC and, again, one of the largest banks in the world, a partner also of ICBC. Senior executives of Standard Bank have to do this to facilitate our work, and therefore to occupy the China-Africa corridor, the corridor between the US and Africa, the corridor between the EU and Africa, and other trading partners with the world, we need capacity to do this. Those changes that you're referring to are calculated to get us to do that work so that we see more of our clients, we see more of our regulators, we drive Africa's growth, and we drive our relationships. And I must just say this, that we are very proud at Standard Bank of the seamless and efficient way of managing human resources. And you're referencing just one example of that. So just to remind you, my partner and I, Kenny, we're out here pounding the pavements of Beijing, generating business for Standard Bank. That's what those changes are calculated to do.
All right. Tshabalala, the CEO or Group CEO of Standard Bank, thank you so much for making time for us.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions,
your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.